All right. So I'm just going to put the outline up on the screen. Period 4 is, I think, maybe the most difficult period. There's a lot going on, and it's easy to lose one's sense of chronology, okay, because there are a lot of different themes. And so sometimes teachers will teach one theme and then go back and teach another theme. And there are a couple periods like that. I would say this period and then period 6 is like that too, the Gilded Age period. Okay, and I think those two are the easiest to lose your chronology. Okay, so we'll try to make sense of it. So let me share it. And I don't think anybody else is in the waiting room right now. Doesn't appear so. Okay, so what I tried to do, oh, there we go. All right, so I think the, I'm going to put here, I'm going to add something here to the political change, okay? What's really important is I'm going to put the collapse of the first party system and the rise of the second party system. Okay, and we'll talk about what that is. Hopefully you remember that. But I think a nice way to approach this time period is to break it up into 4 different themes. Okay, the first one is political change, then territorial expansion, economic change, and then social change. Okay, and in particular with the social change, looking at mostly antebellum reform, a lot of which comes out of the Second Great Awakening. So we'll talk a bit about the Second Great Awakening. I think somebody just rang the doorbell again, but I can't. No, maybe not. Okay. So we're going to be going through it more or less chronologically. Okay, so the outline is not broken up into themes. Okay, but just pay attention to it as we're getting to one of those. Okay, so the period starts with Jefferson, and I think I do need to add some things here, maybe not. Be familiar with Jefferson's first inaugural address. That's a document you should be very familiar with. It's the first election in which one political party, where you have a transfer of power from one political party to another political party. And even though Jefferson's views are very different from the Federalists, he reaches out to the Federalists in his inaugural address. And he very famously says, you know, we're all Federalists, we're all Democratic Republicans. Okay. And he's, you know, basically says he's there to represent the entire country, not just his party. And that's a precedent for future transfers of power. And for the most part, with a couple of exceptions, maybe, we see presidents reaching out to the other, presidents-elect reaching out to the other side when they initially come into office anyway. So I did include that there. Jefferson calls it the election, or excuse me, years later, he refers to it as the election of 1800 because he sees it as, you know, the common man and a more democratic philosophy overthrowing or overturning, whatever you want to say, a more aristocratic administration. Okay, in reality, you see some changes, but it's relatively moderate, the changes that take place. He does shrink the size of the government. He repeals the whiskey tax. The Sedition Act is repealed, but he does keep some Federalist policies in place, like the National Bank, right, which he had been very strongly against. With regards to some of the early political issues, I think it's important to know his relationship with the courts, and in particular, with John Marshall, okay, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. John Marshall was appointed right at the end of Adams's term, along with these last-minute judges, right, that we call the midnight judges. And that becomes a source of conflict, okay? And that leads to the case Marbury versus Madison. I would not worry too much about the facts of the case. Just that Madison, who was Jefferson's Secretary of State, would not deliver the commission letter that would formalize Marbury's appointment to the Supreme Court. And so Marbury sues Madison for that official letter that would, as I said, formalize the appointment. And Marshall, he requests that Marshall issue something called the Writ of Mandamus. And Marshall, hold on, somebody else is coming in. Where are we here? Just one second. Nope, you're not there anymore. Okay. So anyway, what Marshall rules is that he can't issue this writ because the Congress did not have the authority to give the court that authority in the first place. And so people just keep coming in. Sorry. And so he declares the law unconstitutional. The Judiciary Act of 1789, which had given them that power. What you really need to know about the case is that it establishes the principle of judicial review, okay, which is the authority of the Supreme Court to decide the constitutionality of federal law. Keep in mind, this really, even though technically Jefferson and Madison win the case because they didn't have to deliver the commission letter to Marbury, they were very unhappy with the decision. If you remember at the end of our last session on Tuesday, can anybody just explain what Jefferson and Madison's view, what their view was on who had the authority to decide the constitutionality of federal law? And it's a nice conflict or a nice disagreement between the Federalists and Democratic Republicans. Alexander, is your hand up there? Go ahead.
So Jefferson's point of view is that only the states could decide the constitutionality of any law.
Right. Okay. And where did he assert that?
He wrote the Kentucky one, right? And Madison wrote the Virginia one.
Perfect. Excellent. Very good. Right. So in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. So if you ever get an essay where you need to discuss, differences between the Federalists and Democratic Republicans, that's another issue to write about. You don't just have to discuss economic policy or states' rights versus federal power. You can discuss the authority of the Supreme Court, and it does fit in with the issue of states' rights as well, right, from their perspective. So the next major issue with Jefferson is the Louisiana Purchase, and this would fit in if you ever got an essay on territorial expansion from, people keep coming in, territorial expansion from, say, 1800 to 1850. It's a good example, right? And when you're looking at the motives behind it, it was primarily for trade. Jefferson was seeking to have control over New Orleans. A few years earlier, the United States had signed a treaty with Spain called the Pinckney Treaty, which gave Americans the right of deposit there. But in 1800, Napoleon France reacquired, right? They had it originally, and now they reacquired the Louisiana Territory. And so there were concerns that Napoleon would now shut out American farmers and merchants from using that port. And so that was the initial motive, okay? So it was an outlet for Western crops. But of course, Napoleon offers the entire territory, and which certainly fit in with Jefferson's vision for the country. Remember, he supported agrarianism, and now this opportunity to acquire all of that land would help further that vision. And so he's very interested in it, but there is a snag over constitutionality, right? And I'm sure most of you know this, and that is that as a strict constructionist, he didn't believe it was constitutional and actually suggested that a constitutional amendment be passed to allow the federal government to purchase territory. His advisors said that's not a good idea, that you should take advantage of it now, that Napoleon could change his mind. And so ultimately, he adopts a more loose constructionist view of the Constitution and says that the purchase falls under the Senate's treaty power, the president's power to sign treaties and the Senate's power to ratify treaties. Okay, so, and he makes the purchase. One of the other things that could, somebody just came in, there they are, okay. The other thing I would know with territorial expansion is reasons for opposition. The Federalists were actually opposed to the Louisiana Purchase. Can anybody explain why the Federalists would oppose the acquisition of that territory? And you're going to see this opposition continue. Sophie?
Because weren't the Federalists supported by like the people in the North who were more industrial, and the Democratic Republicans supported by like the farmers in the South and in the West? So with more territory, there's going to be more farmers and more people are going to support the Democratic Republicans.
You got it exactly. Right? You said it extremely well. Okay. And so, and with that, right, you would have more states coming in from the West, which would be agrarian states, and in all likelihood would be Democratic Republican states. And that's something to keep in mind. If you ever had an essay or a short answer question that where you had to write about the decline of the first party system, right? And the first party system refers to Democratic Republicans and Federalists. Expansion westward was a big issue because as more states are coming in from the West, right, as Ohio comes in and Kentucky and Tennessee and Alabama and Indiana, as those states come in, those are Democratic Republican states. And that really, makes the Federalists a super small minority and gives the Democratic Republicans a supermajority by the time you get to the end of the War of 1812. So that's a good issue to when you're either way, if you're talking about the political parties or opposition to expansion, that's a good argument. The other thing is it's kind of it's interesting how the Federalists now are crying foul that Jefferson is violating the Constitution, right, and that it was unconstitutional. And so this is another thing to consider is that when, why is it that Jefferson is a strict constructionist in the 1790s, but he's willing to adopt a looser view during the early 1800s as president? And it has a lot to do when you're out of power, you're always seeking to limit the power of who's in power, right? And then once you acquire that power yourself, then of course you're looking to expand it. So it's a very common thing in politics, right? That whoever is in control of the federal government, they're going to be loose constructionists and looking to expand power. Those who are out of power are always trying to limit it. Okay, and you see that here with both the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. So the last thing that's really big with Jefferson are the some of the foreign policy problems he has. And the one that you would want to focus on, I think, primarily is with Britain and France. So you have the Napoleonic Wars break out in the early in the 1800s. And once again, Europe is at war with itself. And you see some parallels to what goes on during the 1790s. And so the United States is actually benefiting from the conflict because we're trading with both Britain and France and profiting from the war. And in response to that, can anybody explain what Britain and France's policies were towards the United States? Oh, let me show you something here. Did a cartoon just pop up? I can't see the screen. There's a little hint for you. Those of you in my class should remember that cartoon. Yes. So the guy in the middle is Jefferson, right? Sarah, you want to explain that?
I don't know if it's what we're referred to with the picture, but didn't they both start seizing American ships? I can't really read what they're saying on the picture.
Yeah, okay, yeah. It's just for the images. I like the picture of Napoleon. And then you have Jefferson in the middle. And that would be King. Actually, King George III is still alive and still in power then. So go ahead, Sarah, explain that.
Yeah, but I think they both started essentially seizing the ships and taking the sailors. I forgot what the term was called, but it was they essentially made them work for their own navies.
So that's what the British were doing with the sailors. You're right with the seizing of ships, right? Both sides were seizing American ships and cargoes. So with regards to the British and the seizing of American sailors, anybody remember what that practice was called? Amy?
I think it was impressment.
Is that right, Sana?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Sarah, that's what you were thinking of, right? Okay. Excellent. Very good. And so in response to that, so one of the things I'd point out also, if you get an essay on foreign policy, it's a nice thing. And you're talking about, say, American neutrality, right? So here, and there's a really obvious comparison to a later war that you can make, right? That you guys studied much more recently, where American navigation rights were being infringed upon, I would argue, by both sides, but we tend to focus on one side. What more recent war? That's Alexander. And you're not in my class. This kills me that my students can't answer this. Go ahead, Alexander. What is it? Absolutely, World War I. So we focus on the German U-boats, right, and the submarine warfare. Keep in mind the British had mined the North Sea and blockaded Germany, which effectively kept out American trade, right? But the United States wasn't complaining about that. It was mostly the German submarine warfare. So you see a similar situation. So how does Jefferson try to, what I want to say is how difficult it is to follow Washington's foreign policy advice, right? He says maintain commercial relations with Europe, trade, but stay politically detached. And it's so difficult to achieve that, okay, when they're at war with each other. So how does Jefferson and Congress respond to this situation? I am going to give you another clue. Let's see here. Why can't I move this down?
I think that they threatened to cut off trade with both countries, and then it's if they stop seizing the ships, and then they'll only trade with one country and put an embargo on the other. So then they trade with France, and it makes the English economy weaker.
So you just ran through, very good, Lizzie. The one thing I would change with what you said was the threat to cut off trade. Okay, so I'm having trouble getting to other slides. Here we go. Okay, so, but you ran through right until the end. You actually took it right through to a law called Makin's Bill number 2. Anybody know what that cartoon is a comment on? What policy? It's a very memorable one. Sabrina?
The Embargo Act.
It's the Embargo Act, right. So this actually did cut off trade, right, with not just Britain and France, but everyone. And it turns out to be a disaster, mostly for the United States. And it was unpopular with both Federalists and Democratic Republicans. And so it is repealed. This is passed right at the end of Jefferson, or towards the end of Jefferson's administration. And then when Madison comes in 1809, it is repealed. Okay, it's replaced with another law, which I wouldn't worry too much about, called the Non-Intercourse Act, which cut off trade with just Britain and France, which again was unpopular. And so then it was replaced with another law, which Lizzie was describing, which was Macon's Bill number 2, which said the United States would open up trade with both countries, but we would cut off trade with the enemy of whoever stopped seizing our ships first. And so France, Napoleon says, we're not going to seize American ships. He rescinds what were known as his imperial decrees. And so then the United States cuts off trade with Britain. Now, I would argue that while this was an important issue and source of conflict between Britain and the United States, there were other reasons why the United States went to war against Britain, and that this just served as a justification for war. Can anybody explain the other issues? Who actually supported war against Great Britain and why they supported war? Noah?
I think it was the natives because they were, I guess, aligned with Britain, right? Or they got like Britain was like what when they okay, never mind. But yeah, the natives.
So when you say the Native Americans, what is their, how did they play a role in causing the war?
I'm not sure.
All right, so you got it. I think that's really important. Nathan, I see that you raised your hand.
So the British supplied the natives with arms, and then the natives were fighting the white settlers. So the white settlers wanted to go to war with Britain, so Britain would stop supplying them with weapons.
Everybody got that? So you had, there was a Native American leader named Tecumseh, who was leading resistance in the West against American settlement there. And the line of settlement was about where Indiana is now. There was a battle just before the War of 1812 called the Battle of Tippecanoe, which was a major battle, and the Native Americans were using British-made weapons. And so you had a group of young congressmen, there's one of them, led by Henry Clay. John C. Calhoun was another one, congressman from Tennessee, Felix Grundy. And they were from the South and West, and they weren't really impacted by the British restrictions on American shipping. Okay, they were much more concerned about expanding westward and eliminating that Native American resistance. And so what they argued is that if they defeated the British in Canada and conquered Canada, not only would the United States get more territory, but it would open up the West to settlement. And so they were the ones who were pushing for war. Who was opposed to going to war against Great Britain? Sana?
The Federalists, because they thought it would hurt their trade.
Absolutely. They knew the British would blockade the coast and that they wouldn't be able to trade. And also, if they did open up the West to settlement, keep in mind, that would be more Democratic Republican states. So that's another political reason. So you see something similar to the Louisiana Purchase, right? And I would put the War of 1812 I would put it in the category of westward expansion, and that it is a failed effort to acquire territory. And while it failed to acquire Canada, ultimately, it did open more of the West to settlement as the Native Americans were defeated there. There are a lot of nice comparisons you can make. When you are, a question that they've asked as an essay question in the past is, to what extent can the War of 1812 be called, or to what extent is the Second American Revolution or the Second War for American Independence an appropriate label for the War of 1812? Okay, and that is a question that's actually been asked. And you can discuss both the causes of the war and the results. Okay, now with regards to the causes, you can compare it to two earlier wars, right? It's similar to the French and Indian War because the British, now in this war, the British and Native Americans are allied against settlers who want to push west. In the French and Indian War, it was the French in Canada who were allied with the Native Americans trying to prevent westward expansion. And I would also, a really good comparison is to the American Revolution, because not only did you have that issue with the Proclamation of 1763 and the British, who had controlled Canada at that time, trying to stop American colonists from moving west. That was a major issue, but they also restricted American trade. And, the actual British policy that led to their seizing ships was that, and they were known as orders in council, that any neutral ship that was going to go to continental Europe first had to go to Great Britain to be inspected before they went to continental Europe. Okay, that reminded Americans very much of mercantilism. And so that's a nice comparison to make if you're comparing this war to the American Revolution, that restrictions on trade and efforts to limit westward migration helped cause both conflicts. Okay. The war itself, you really don't need to know anything except one thing. And like any war, it's mostly the politics that you need to know. You don't need to know battles, right? It might be nice to know that Jackson becomes a hero, right? Because of in particular, the Battle of New Orleans. Okay. And so that helps him politically later on. But the major event during the war that you need to know is the Hartford Convention. Can anybody just explain what happened at the Hartford Convention? Is this what I had up? Oh, God. I have two of these. Yeah, this is the one I guess I was using. I have two documents with exactly the same name. Oh, well, they're almost exactly the same name. So here we are. Does anybody know what can anybody explain what the Hartford Convention was? Sophie, go ahead.
Wasn't it when like some of the northern states met to discuss like secession from the Union or something because they were mad because of the war going on because they were losing trade with Britain and the states were losing money?
Great. Okay, so part of it was economic. So they didn't actually propose secession at the war. They said we're going to meet next year in Boston if we don't get what we want. Noah, you had your hand up?
I was just going to say that, like, similar to Sophie, like, it was in New England and they, like, weren't in favor of the war.
Yeah. So very good. And this is what they actually ended up doing, which was proposing a series of amendments to the Constitution that would protect the interests of the Federalists and also New England merchants. So it would make it much more difficult to impose trade embargoes, like would require a 2/3 majority, require a 2/3 majority to go to war. It would require a 2/3 majority vote to admit new states, right? So they wanted to try to limit the number of states coming into the Union because they'd all be in the West and Democratic Republican states. They had one that you couldn't have two presidents in a row from the same state because they were bothered that Madison became president after Jefferson. So they had all of these amendments that really either would have given the Federalists a minority veto over, like, allow, if you had, just over a third, you could block, 65% of Congress, say 65% was Federalist or a Democratic Republican, the 35% that was Federalist would be able to block what they wanted to do. Okay, so it was essentially giving them a minority veto over what the Democratic Republicans were doing. And of course, when the amendments are brought to Washington and introduced, word is just arriving that the Treaty of Ghent has been signed, word's arriving that Jackson has won the Battle of New Orleans, and it just made the Federalists look really, really bad, that they couldn't take joy in this, in the war being over and this great victory of Jackson. In their opposition to the war, they were perceived by many as being, some said treasonous, but really just unpatriotic, and it helped contribute to their decline. And so they really become irrelevant after the War of 1812, and by the election of 1820, they no longer exist as a party. Okay, so when you're looking at the results of the war, it's kind of interesting that, you know, certainly that there's more respect abroad. They fought Britain to a tie, essentially. But even though the Federalists opposed to it, it did more than anything else up until that point to promote American manufacturing. Because of the British blockade, the United States was forced to manufacture. A blockade is far more effective than any protective tariff that could be passed, right? Hamilton never got his protective tariff, but the war did so much more, okay? You do see the decline of the Federalists. Where the Democratic Republicans really do very well is here. So even though the British are not defeated, the Native Americans are. Tecumseh is killed during the war, and Native American resistance east of the Mississippi River is effectively broken. And so you have increased settlement of the West. You have some heroes. 2 presidents come out of the war, Jackson and Harrison. All right. So that gives rise now to, this is a great essay question. Everybody should be prepared for this on the era of good feelings. To what, it's either to what extent was the period really in the decade following the War of 1812 really an era of good feelings? To what extent was the era of good feelings a period of strong nationalism? And so it's a really great period to look at the tension, right, that we see throughout much of American history between sectionalism and nationalism. Those who are promoting greater unity and those who are looking out more for states' interests or local or regional interests, right? So that expression was actually came from a newspaper reporter who, when James Madison was traveling to Boston in 1820, he ran unopposed. There was no challenge to, or excuse me, did I say Madison? Or did I say Monroe? Monroe. It was James Monroe who's running for re-election in 1820. And as he travels up to Boston, he was greeted by cheering crowds. And so the newspaper reporter commented in his article that it was an era, it was American politics had entered a new period, an era of good feelings. Keep in mind, Boston was the center of federalism, federalism as a political party. And here he was being greeted warmly. When you look at why it's considered a period of strong nationalism, certainly the disappearance of the Federalists is one. But what's really important here is that you see changes within the Democratic Republican Party. So while the Federalist Party is effectively dead, their ideas are living on and actually being embraced by many Democratic Republicans, in particular Henry Clay. So the first protective tariff passed in American history is the Tariff of 1816. Okay, and then you had the Second Bank of the United States, but Second Bus, is also in 1816. So these are passed with, you had super majorities of Democratic Republicans, and they're being passed with Democratic Republican support. During the war, they recognized that new industries were developing, and now those industries needed protection. Okay, and they saw the value in having a stable currency, and so supported the Second Bank of the United States. And so these policies become central. Know this very well. Clay's American system fits into so many different essay questions. All right, an essay question on the era of good feelings, an essay question on the market revolution, an essay question on Jackson. All right, because the American system becomes the cornerstone of the Whig philosophy, right, of the Whig economic philosophy, right? When we see the second party system emerge in the 1830s, right, that's what they're embracing. So there's so many different, even if you're talking about the nullification crisis, which we, I think we talked a little bit about that the last meeting. You can work in Clay's American System, right? You can really show what you know in a lot of different essays, just knowing Clay's American System. So know it. So there are three parts to it. We call it economic nationalism because the goal was to achieve self-sufficiency or economic independence, and also to unify the country. So it included a high protective tariff, a second Bank of the United States, and those are very similar to Hamilton. Sometimes people who embrace Clay's American System were, before you had the Whigs, some historians refer to them as neo-federalists. And what's different between his proposals and Hamilton's is the third proposal, where Hamilton was using debt to unite the country. He wanted the federal government to build roads and canals, to fund the building of roads and canals, so that the East, West, and South, their access to raw materials and markets would be made much easier with these internal improvements. We'll talk about that more with the market revolution. You see the United States asserting much more confidence in foreign policy during the era of good feelings, and you see this with the acquisition of Florida, where basically Jackson, without permission, he was a general, launches an invasion of Florida, and John Quincy Adams, who was the Secretary of the State at that time, not president, sees that as an opportunity to try to push Spain into giving up Florida. And so Spain agreed to cede Florida to the United States. I didn't put it in there. The United States was claiming that Texas was part of the Louisiana Purchase prior to this. And so the United States gave up its claims to Texas temporarily. Keep in mind, Spain would lose it within 2 years in the Mexican Revolution. But you also have the Monroe Doctrine, where the United States is asserting that Latin America is closed to further European colonial ventures there. Okay, so didn't say that the United States would do anything about it. Okay, the language was it would be a sign of an unfriendly disposition towards the United States. And so the Monroe, but again, what you're seeing, I think, with both of these is the United States is showing much more self-confidence in foreign policy. And that was a major result. If you wanted to discuss the War of 1812 and how the U.S. was becoming more self-confident, would be a nice thing to write about. Judicial nationalism, okay? No John Marshall, not just Marbury versus Madison. No, a couple of the later decisions that they do two things, okay? They expand the power of the federal government using the Elastic Clause and sometimes the Commerce Clause, the Interstate Commerce Clause. And while he's expanding the power of the federal government, he's limiting states' rights. And the best example, if you're to know one, this is the case I would know, is McCulloch v. Maryland. Because in that case, he's doing both, all right? The Marshall Court is doing both. So there are two questions in that case. One, does Congress, so what was happening, and this is nice too, if you want to show how Clay's American System became a source of dispute, here it is, the bank, right? And you have Maryland, who doesn't like the Bank of the United States. They wanted people and businesses to use state-chartered banks, imposed a special tax on transactions at the Bank of the United States. So the question that the Marshall Court needs to consider is, first, can Congress create a national bank? Is it within their constitutional powers? And second, if they do have that power, can a state tax a federal institution? And so to the first question, the court says yes. The Elastic Clause, along with the Commerce Clause and the Tax Clause, allows Congress to create a national bank, okay? And on the second question, can a state tax a federal institution? And the answer is no. That would violate the Supremacy Clause. It would put state governments above the federal government. And the Constitution and the Supremacy Clause says that the laws, treaties, and the Constitution itself are the supreme law of the land. So that means above any state law, so long as that federal law is constitutional. And so it's a significant limit on states' rights. Okay. I put a couple other cases there. Be familiar with them as martial court decisions. Any case that you see from 1801 to 1835 is going to be a martial court decision. When you're talking about the Federalist philosophy living on beyond the Federalist Party, that's a nice thing to mention as well. Not only did you have people like Clay who are now embracing Federalist ideas, but the Federalist Party lives on with John Marshall and the decisions of the Marshall Court. Okay, so that's a nice thing to mention if that should come up in any sort of essay. I put some other ones there. Okay, so this is now the sectionalism. My feeling is, if you were to get an essay question on this, I would lean towards sectionalism, and that it wasn't a period of strong nationalism, that on its surface, it appears to be, you know, there's a kind of this appearance of unity, but really because, and this is where your analysis is, because the regions of the country, the North, the South, and the West differed economically. They had a different set of economic interests, and as a result came into conflict over economic policy and also slavery, right? So it's important to say that it's a result of their economic differences, right? That's where your analysis comes in. And so the first major dispute, we kind of get a preview of the major issues that are going to lead to the Civil War. When Missouri applies for statehood, okay, they apply for admission as a slave state. That, of course, is opposed by the North. This is a really nice detail to include if you include the Talmadge Amendment. It was a Northern proposal that would provide for the gradual end to slavery in Missouri. Over a period of time, no new slaves could be brought into the state, and the state, at the age of 25, a slave would be freed. And over time, that would likely bring an end to slavery there. So it passed the House of Representatives, where the North had a majority, and Southern congressmen actually threatened to secede if the Talmadge Amendment was passed, because it would set a precedent for other states that came in. Anytime a slave state came in, they would do the same thing, right? And so what happens ultimately, Henry Clay, who later becomes known as the Great Compromiser, works out a compromise. And of course, that's the Missouri Compromise. And so Maine was separated from Massachusetts, comes in as a free state. And then that area in the Louisiana Purchase territory. So that balances. So now you have to have this, it sets kind of a precedent. Now every time a slave state comes in, a free state comes in, right? And that sectional balance is maintained up till 1850. And that's when California comes in, and that's when you start to see the balance really start to shift towards the North, and the South starts to get very worried once the balance starts going in that direction. But for the time being, for the next 30 years, that balance is maintained. So let me just, I'm just going to, just want to show you the map. Missouri Compromise can be used in a lot of different, you know, certainly as an issue, as a cause of the Civil War, something on the era of good feelings, how territorial expansion becomes a divisive issue, right? Divides the North and the South. So it's a good thing to know. But anyway, there you see, that's the line, the 3630 line. As you can see, the North seems to get a much better deal, right? And later on, just to give you a little preview, over time, the South increasingly gets upset with this deal and wishes that they hadn't agreed to this. And does anybody remember what law later on repeals the Missouri Compromise, that part of the Missouri Compromise, and leads to a complete mess as a result of its repeal? Let me just see here. Alexander, go ahead.
The Kansas-Nebraska Act.
Excellent. Very good. It is indeed, right? So that area, so what did it do? That area that had been closed to slavery,
It
what did
opened up via popular sovereignty.
perfect, right? And that, of course, leads to Bleeding Kansas, right? And that becomes a major, major issue leading to the Civil War. Very good. Okay, so let me go back to this. Okay, so, I think the Missouri Statehood Bill issue it shows that the slavery issue can really divide the country. If you want to take the position of unity, you can say ultimately, while it was a polarizing issue, ultimately they did come to a compromise, and the Missouri Compromise helped keep the country together for the next 30 years or 34 years until it was repealed by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So you can go either way with the Missouri Compromise, right? Just as long as your argument is defensible. Doesn't have to be right. Okay, the other major issue is the Panic of 1819. And you don't need to worry so much about the causes, other than it was caused largely by over-speculation in land. Most panics are caused by over-speculation in something, right? So you have over-speculation in land that helps bring about the panic. It's the first depression since the United States had become an independent country, and it hurt the South and West in particular. And the Northeast really wasn't that impacted by it. And because it was only 3 years after the passage of the first protective tariff and the chartering of the Second Bank of the United States, the South and West turned against those policies of Clay's American system. So the South became very much opposed to the protective tariff. Okay, that it led to retaliatory tariffs from Britain and Europe, which hurt American exports of cotton to those countries. And the West hated the bank because of its tight money policies. They liked what small farmers liked, inflationary money policies. And you had a banking system at that time where banks printed their own banknotes. And oftentimes that contributed to inflation, which farmers were perfectly fine with. Anyway, Clay's American system, which was intended to bring the country together, now becomes a source of discord. And if you want to bring it forward a bit, okay, it's fine, even if it's a question on the era of good feelings. I think it's perfectly appropriate to say, by 1828, the South had become so strongly opposed to it, right, that you had John C. Calhoun writing the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, claiming that states could declare it unconstitutional. And then in 1832, you had the nullification crisis over the tariff, right? But that Southern opposition, it's interesting. John C. Calhoun actually voted for the tariff of 1816, right? He supported it in 1816. And then after the panic, became very anti-tariff. That's a really nice detail to put into an essay, just how that shift there. So it's a nice essay question. Be prepared for it. Also, it's great to discuss with the market revolution. Anything with Clay's American system, even the Panic of 1819, can work in with the market revolution. This topic is very now just such a big topic. They've had a lot of questions in recent years on the market revolution, in particular LEQs. I don't know that they've had a big DBQ on it. Maybe you'll get one this year. I don't know. I can't remember if they've had a DBQ on the market revolution. But know it well. Okay, so it refers to the economic changes taking place in the United States from 1800 to 1860. Think of it as three major changes. Okay, one is the Industrial Revolution, okay, which is primarily affecting the Northeast. So the North is industrializing, but you also have significant changes taking place in the other regions. The South, right, is shifted from tobacco production to cotton, right? And so you see the emergence of what Southerners later in the 1850s, forget who the writer is, but refers to it as King Cotton, right? He says cotton is king. But so cotton growing becomes very important in the West, or excuse me, in the South, and in the West, it becomes mostly the kind of the breadbasket, the grain growing region. Okay, but with that, those three distinct regions, the reason why we call it the market revolution is they became markets for each other's goods, right? They became integrated. And what allows for the integration of these three economies are developments in transportation, okay? In particular, early on, roads, okay, which doesn't seem like a huge technological development, but it was when you're talking about a lot of frontier and wilderness, and also canals. So that's come up before. You need to know what period is the canal building boom and the road building boom. And it's really from 1790 to 1830 is when they're building canals and a lot of roads. Do you know what changes in 1830 with transportation? It becomes the big thing. Sabrina?
The railroad system.
It's railroads. Yep. And that right up until the automobile, really, right? And even today, railroads are so significant. We're not using the Erie Canal too much for trade these days, right? But railroads, when you're talking about domestic trade, it's railroads. So really, really important. So know the roads and canals initially, then the railroads to connect the country. I put the causes here. Why now is always the question to consider. Why are these changes happening at this particular time, right? And that's where you get a lot into your analysis when you're answering that why now question. And so you had Inventions and Innovations. Samuel Slater was actually not an innovator. He was a thief who stole factory plans from England and was able to start a textile factory in Rhode Island. Eli Whitney, of course, during the War of 1812, he developed a system for making guns with, having all the same parts. And so he applies interchangeable parts in gun making, which is very helpful for mass production. He also invented the cotton gin, which any essay on slavery and the development of slavery during this time period, you have to mention the cotton gin, okay? But it has really two important impacts. As I think you all know, that it increases the demand for slaves, right? Because now that cotton was profitable, they can grow it. They needed more labor to pick cotton. But land, that push westward, right? And especially that southern push westward into like Texas, right? That is driven by cotton growers. So, and also cotton exhausts the soil very quickly. And so there was this real land hunger among cotton growers and pushing westward to acquire more and more land. So it is a driving force behind territorial expansion. And so those are, and then the West, grain act, much more small scale, smaller farms, 160-acre farms, right? And a lot of grain growing. By the 1840s, you had the McCormick Reaper, which harvested the wheat, okay? And so you start to see the development of commercial agriculture in the West. Now, one of the things, I don't have a diagram, but if you can visualize this, I usually draw it on the board. I don't really have a board to draw on. The North is the hub of this system during the market revolution, okay? The West and the South really don't have a real economic connection, right? Because the North is buying Southern cotton and manufacturing it into textiles, right? And then they'll take the textiles and they'll sell it to the West or they'll sell it to the South. So that you have that strong economic relationship between the North and the South. The West was a market for Northern goods, but also the North was a market for Western grain. So they had an economic connection. There wasn't a strong economic connection between the West and the South. They didn't have textile factories in the West, so there was no demand for Southern cotton, right? They could grow wheat in the South, right? And so there wasn't a demand for Western wheat in the South, okay? So the North is the hub of this economic system. It's why the North increasingly grows economically more and more powerful. It's not only the center of manufacturing, it's the center of trade, right? All trade is basically going through the Northeast. There was something else I wanted to say with that. I forgot, it'll come to me. We already talked about Clay's American system. Clay's American system is trying to further this along. He's trying to accelerate these changes. And then you have the other thing I'd point out with Europe during this period, during the market revolution, the United States is largely turning its back on Europe, right? And you see that with the high protective tariffs that are passed during this time period. With the transportation, Clay isn't that successful in getting federal approval for internal improvements. A lot of congressmen thought it was unconstitutional. The South opposed federal funding for internal improvements because the internal improvements really weren't benefiting them. It was mostly benefiting the North and the West. You have natural highways between the South and the North, right? You have the Mississippi River, the Ohio River, the Atlantic Ocean. Those were the primary trade routes. It's going east to west where you need that man-made transportation. And so the South is like, why should we be paying to connect the North and the West? So, when you look at projects, the most significant project of the time period is the Erie Canal, which connects the Great Lakes to the Hudson River and allows New York to emerge as the East Coast connection to the West, right? And so it helps New York develop into the dominant city on the East Coast. This is really important, the factory system and labor. Can anybody explain the Lowell system? This is huge on this test.
It was like a system where all the manufacturing was done under like one factory, and it was also like pretty huge because it allowed for young women to go and finally have like financial independence.
Well, when you say financial independence, they did employ young women. And you're talking, when we say young women, we're talking, basically age, 14 to 20. And the expectation, I don't know that it gave them financial independence. It did give young women jobs who were basically working on farms before this. It was for the Lowell owners of the factories. It was cheap labor. Aways, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just about to say what you just said, that weren't women paid basically nothing because they were women, and the Lowell system tried to scapegoat them to minimize any costs?
Yeah, or to exploit them, right?
Yeah.
So very early on, there was a strike of Lowell workers against the conditions that they faced, and they marketed it. The factory owners marketed the Lowell system as something that was a safe place for young women, and that they would provide education, in particular moral education to young women, and that was a way to get farm families to say, okay, it's okay for our daughters to go and work in this system. And they advertised it with very nice dormitories, so they lived in the factory town, right? And they were under the constant supervision of the factory owners. And you do see, certainly to Jackie's point, you do see women in some sense, I guess, because they're moving into the workforce, being somewhat empowered. But I don't think it was enough to give financial independence. The expectation was that once they had done their stint in the Lowell mills, they would go and get married, when they were around 20 or in their early 20s. But what they were looking for, the factory owners, was cheap labor. And this is really before you have any major wave of immigration. The number of immigrants was relatively low compared to later years. Okay, so just going to say young women from Western Massachusetts farms recruited to work in textile mills. So the Lowell system, this system starts to end in the 1840s and into the 1850s. They still maintain the textile factories, but the workers are replaced by Irish immigrants. So with the Irish potato famine, you have this huge wave of Irish immigrants that are coming in to the United States, and that becomes the next source of cheap labor. What I didn't put here, because I think I have a separate section on it. I hope I have a set on slavery. When you're making distinctions between the North and the South, you have to discuss labor systems, right? And it's not, you could discuss when you're discussing, if you're comparing and contrasting the respective economies, don't just talk about what they're producing, right? Write about their labor system. So the South, of course, relies on slave labor, and the North mention the Lowell system and then get into immigrant labor later on during the first half of the 19th century. Question to consider with the market system: do these changes help unite the country? This is the common theme, right? Nationalism versus sectionalism. Do they help bring the country together, or do they divide it? Very similar to a kind of era of good feelings question. I would be more inclined to argue, I just think it's easier to argue that because you had three different regional economies, those economic differences would lead to differences over economic policy, okay, which would lead to disputes over the tariff, would lead to disputes over slavery. You can even work in the free soil position, right? That in the West, the small farmers did not want slavery, right? In Western territories, right? They didn't want to compete with slave labor, and they didn't want to compete with plantation owners, right? And so the Westerners were opposed to slavery, but not because they were, concerned about human rights abuses, right? They were opposed to slavery because they didn't want to compete with slave labor, and they didn't want plantation owners to take up all the land in the West. So you can even work that in. Okay, Jackson. The Age of Jackson is the next period. Great for an essay, right? When we talk about, don't just think, when you're talking about Jacksonian era, don't focus just on Jackson. Okay, really, when historians are writing about the era, sometimes they call it the era of the common man. And what you're seeing is ordinary, common people having a lot more political power. And that is a result largely of some of the political changes that had taken place not during the Jacksonian era, but prior to it. And so over time, from about 1800 to 1828, when Jackson is elected, you had a lot of states that were eliminating property qualifications for voting. Additionally, you had Western states that are coming into the Union that never had property requirements for voting. Poll taxes were ended in many states. They'll come back later at the end of the 19th century to disenfranchise African Americans, but you did have states that were ending poll taxes. So all of this is giving the common man more of an opportunity to vote. Additionally, the Electoral College is now being chosen by voters rather than by state legislatures. So it's up to each state to decide how their electors are chosen. States were passing those reforms to give voters that say. I think I have a chart coming up on the second party system on here somewhere. So, but another major change, third parties. You have minor parties that are very much grassroots. The original major parties were created kind of by the elites, and now you have third parties. One of the most significant of this time period is called the anti-Masons, right? I don't know if you know who the Masons are, that secret society Masons, right? The Freemasons. And you had a lot of conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theories are not unique to present day United States in our politics. This is something that we've seen throughout American history. Seriously, and this belief that the Masons, and Jackson was a Mason, were somehow conspiring to control everything. And that's a conspiracy theory that's been around for a long time, but it actually led to the formation of an anti-Jackson party, the anti-Masons. The anti-Masons were eventually absorbed by the Whigs, okay? But they were the first political party to have a national convention, where rather than having just party elites choose candidates for president, they had a national convention that allowed more party members to have a say in that process. You didn't have primaries yet, but it did open it up to more people to make those decisions. And then that was in 1831. By 1832, both the Democrats and 1832, they were still calling themselves the National Republicans, would have national conventions. By 1836, they were then the Whigs. But we'll talk about the second party system in just a second. Now with mass politics, in order to get elected, you have to appeal to the common man, which means oftentimes talking like a common man and behaving like a common man and, kissing babies and showing up at carnivals and parades and all that sort of thing. What we recognize so much as part of our politics, right? Holding rallies, right? All of that. That's all that starts during the Jacksonian era. And you start to see the West becoming more influential for the first time. Jackson is the first president from the West. I know Tennessee doesn't seem like the West, but at the time, Tennessee was considered the West, right? I don't know why economic, I'm putting industrialization in the North as Jacksonian. You do have a working class that in northern cities that gravitates towards the Democratic Party. Tammany Hall is starting about 1850. It probably goes back to the 1840s. I would check on that, but still, that's a little bit after the Jacksonian era. I don't know why I put that there. Okay, socially, you have the Second Great Awakening, okay, which was a religious revival, and there's no one idea within the Second Great Awakening. You had a lot of different religious groups that emerge. We had one group that were called Millerites, which today are Seventh-day Adventists, if you've heard of that religious group. Mormons, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, LDS, developed during this particular time period. One idea, though, that you see a lot that's being preached among Protestant, and in particular what had traditionally been Calvinist churches, was perfectionism. Calvinism, by this point, is no longer embracing the idea of predestination, by the way. Okay, that they had moved away, like Baptists and Methodists and Congregationalists had really moved away from that. But they did embrace an idea of perfectionism, that one should work towards ridding oneself of sin, but also ridding society of sin. And of course, that will encourage social activism, right, in the reform movements. So I have more information on that later. So what I put here, this is the collapse of the era of good feelings. So the era of good feelings marks the end of the first party system, right? So then you have one political party. And then this event, the corrupt bargain, marks the end of the era of good feelings. So you had four candidates. Jackson was leading both in electoral votes and popular votes, but he didn't have enough electoral votes to outright win the election, so it was decided in the House. And Henry Clay, who was actually in the election, but because he came in fourth, they choose between the top three vote getters. He was not in the runoff, but he threw his support behind John Quincy Adams. Okay, and Adams became president, and then he appointed Henry Clay to be his Secretary of State. Keep in mind, Secretary of State was the stepping stone to the presidency at that time. Every president, except for John Adams and Washington had been a Secretary of State before they became president. Okay, so it looked like John Quincy Adams was setting up Clay to be his successor. Okay, so this led to the formation. So you only had the Democratic Republicans. After that election in 1824, Jackson and his supporters form a faction, which is the Democrats. John Quincy Adams and his supporters form the National Republicans, okay, with Henry Clay. Later, by 1836, technically the National Republicans collapses, and after they lose the 1832 election, and then they reemerge as the Whigs by, I would say, about 1834 or so. They are the Whig Party. If you use the National Republicans and Whigs interchangeably, it's almost easier to do that. And don't worry about that. You can call them Whigs if you want in 1832, and you'll be perfectly fine with that. Okay, that is not an issue. They are almost so interchangeable. Ideologically, they're the same. But anyway, the Revolution of 1828 is when Jackson defeats John Quincy Adams. Okay, I put down some policies with Jackson that you should be familiar with. The spoil system, right, giving jobs to political supporters. Not that it was new. He just expands it and does this particularly at the federal level. He saw it as a good thing, right? He said it's rotation in office. It's good to always have new blood. And when we say the spoil system, we're not talking about Secretary of State and Secretary of the Treasury, right? Those positions always presidents chose, it's not a word, chose their own people for those positions, right? You bring in your own advisors. We're talking about lower level, not policy-making positions, but just carrying out the functions of government, right? So talking about postmasters and people who run customs houses, right, who are collecting tariffs. That's the level we're talking about, okay? They are not policymakers. Today, those positions are largely filled by civil servants. You take a civil service exam, right, and you get into those positions. That doesn't happen until the 1880s, though. The bank war, okay, this is a big issue. It's a great issue, to show how Clay's American system becomes a source of dispute. And when Jackson wants to make it Clay wants to make it a political issue in the election of 1832, which he's going to run for president. And so he puts through a bill to recharter the bank 4 years earlier than it needed to be done. Okay, so the bank was going to be in effect for another 4 years. Jackson, of course, vetoes that bill to recharter the bank, claims that it hurts the common man, okay, and enriches the wealthy, and also argues that it's unconstitutional. And then he proceeds to destroy the existing bank by withdrawing government funds from it. Okay. So the other, one of the results of it, I should have mentioned this, is that now one of the things the Bank of the United States did is it kept these smaller banks, private banks, in check. Private banks would issue their own currency, and they were only supposed to issue as much currency, paper money, as they had gold and silver coin in reserve. But they often issued more paper currency, which led to inflation.